Good afternoon, everybody. This is the Freelance Teacher Podcast once again. Just hoping the school year is going well. It's now early October, and I want to talk to you a little bit about something I saw yesterday that I found interesting that I think you will as well. And I'll link to it below and let you know what's going on with that on the website. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a Google talk I saw. James Grant runs a website and has a newsletter, Grant's Interest Rate Observer, where he and his staff analyze financial markets, and they provide non-standard analysis. They are cold-blooded is the wrong kind of word. They're dedicated to logic, to truth, to reason. They're totally unafraid to go against the status quo. And so Jim Grant is a guest on the financial news networks quite often. And there's a series, Talks at Google, and one of the talks at Google has Jim Grant in it. And it talks about the current day economy, and it mentions his book a little bit where he talks about the financial crisis and depression of 1921 that healed itself. The government and the Fed actually did nothing. They balanced the budget, raised interest rates, lowered taxes, and the financial crisis and depression went away. Which is interesting because now if you were to mention that the government balanced its budget, lower taxes, and close up some of their shops, right? Get rid of some of the government entities, people would see you as retrograde and strange and odd. And Jim Grant, in his own meandering way, alludes to that fact that if you were to talk about going on a gold standard, right? The entire planet was on a gold standard until 1912 or 1914, the entire world. And the United States was as well. And he mentions gold and he talks about it, and he goes and mentions what the premise of his book is, because he wrote a book on the financial crisis, the Great Depression of 1921, and how it healed itself. But he brought up another point to balance that. And he brought up, for lack of a better way to word it, he brought up the history of thought. And he talks about this one author who wrote multiple volumes and essays and books on European history. And this author talks about witchcraft, which is a strange thing to mention, but Ben Bernanke, when talking about people who think about gold and wish for a gold standard, he says that we might as well go on a gold standard, and the people who think that should actually be also rethinking witchcraft or believing in witchcraft, something like that. So Grant takes this off-the-cuff, odd, somewhat foolish comment, very broad, denigrating comment about gold and the people who like it or follow it or think it's a viable commodity to back up a country's money. And he uses that witchcraft idea to allude to this author who writes about witchcraft in the history of Europe. And Grant noticed in this guy's writings that the evolution of thought is not a linear uptick on the graph, like a steady rise on the graph from darkness into the light. It doesn't always get better. And the author, the witchcraft guy, talks about the years 1500 to 1550 in Europe and the United States as being, particularly Europe is what he's talking about, as being just, in terms of witchcraft and people believing in witches and burning witches at the stake, it wasn't going on. It just wasn't happening. Now, 1550 to 1600, well, it's later, and people have advanced, correct? Not so fast. They have not advanced, and there's a huge upsurge in witchcraft. People calling people witches, burning them up at the stake, killing them. Witchcraft is everywhere. Spread of witchcraft, right? I mean, people are mental on this thing. Well, you'd think it may be a blip on the radar because that's just retrograde and backward minded, and there are no witches, right? I mean, come on, let's be serious for a minute. But no, from 1600 to 1650, the phenomena of witchcraft grows, and people believe in more of it, and there's more witchcraft, and there are more witch trials, and there are more people getting killed and accused of witchcraft, and you have major heads of Protestant and Catholic churches and attorneys and heads of state talking about witchcraft. And then it goes up again from 1650 to 1700. And Grant's point is that, and he doesn't say it quite outright, but he says it about finance, that the thinking about finance is not a constant rise of positiveness, of betterness, of things being improved. That it is not necessarily true, that the way things are believed now and the actions of the Federal Reserve and monetary policy and all of the departments of finance and what they're teaching at the universities, that those are necessarily, just because it's later on in our era, better than previous practices. Because if you went to the early 1600s and then to the late 1600s and compared them to the late 15 or early 1500s, the accepted belief would be worse, right? The advent of witchcraft and people getting burned at the stake and these people being possessed by witches and demons, well, you'd have more of that later, and you did have more of it later on. And it's a really great parallel, because people think that now everything you hear from particularly mainstream media, the political world, is, I think it's completely out there. I mean, this election cycle is like nothing I've ever seen. And young people particularly are maybe more susceptible to think, well, if this is the modern way, it must be better than it was 30 years ago. And the policies must be more clear, and we've learned so much, and it just must be superior. And I think Grant's point is a really good one, that just because it's now doesn't mean that what is being done in the world of finance, and I think you can add politics and education, I don't think you can necessarily say that just because it's now, it's better, because the historical record does not show a constant upsurge in thought and belief and reason and evidence and things like that. So it just means that you have sorry to tell you this, but you have an even more difficult job ahead of you in thinking about things on your own, and at times going against the grain, at times going against the accepted thought and the accepted ways. Because if it were 1712 or 1716 instead of 2016, and you didn't think this witchcraft thing was legit, and you didn't believe in it, you'd be the weirdo. You'd be the oddball. And that's what I get called a lot. And I think maybe you keep me company as us fellow oddballs and independent thinkers and libertarian types and counter current philosophers feel. So welcome to the club, and I'll talk to you next time. Have a good one.